On the morning everything happened, Darius Whitfield woke up before sunrise. Even though he was surrounded by the comfort of a presidential suite on the 42nd floor, he was already up, reviewing the final details of the Whitfield Tech Future Summit, an event that promised to bring together brilliant minds of innovation. At 43, Darius was not only a respected name in Silicon Valley, he was the kind of leader who inspired silence upon entering a room. With a composed demeanor, attentive gaze, and measured voice, he had built his company from scratch, facing every obstacle with a mix of elegance and firmness that few could maintain. That day, he wore an impeccable navy blue suit with discreet cufflinks and a watch inherited from his grandfather, a reminder of where he came from and a symbol of something he never allowed to be taken away. The event was to take place at the Grand Monarch Hotel, a five-star establishment in the heart of San Jose, known for its mirrored glass facade and personalized service. When the car stopped at the main entrance, Darius got out with the calm of someone who was exactly where he was meant to be. But something happened there in the first few seconds. The valet looked straight at him and then looked past him as if he were invisible. Without offering any help, he turned on his heel to attend to a white couple that had arrived behind him. Darius said nothing. He simply grabbed his leather briefcase and went in alone. The reception area was immense, with Italian marble and chandeliers that looked like frozen clouds. But what stood out the most was the air of suspended judgment in the environment. As he approached the counter, he was interrupted before he could even introduce himself. "Delivery is through the side door," said the receptionist without looking up. He took a deep breath as if he had been there before. Not in that exact hotel, but in that kind of situation. Still, with the same courtesy that had brought him this far, he replied with a short smile, "I'm Darius Whitfield. I'm here as the keynote speaker for the Whitfield Tech Future Summit. The reservation is under my name." The receptionist paused. Her eyes finally looked up, swept over his face and then his suit, as if still searching for some confirmation that this was real. "Just a moment," she said, picking up the phone but not dialing anything. Meanwhile, Darius noticed that another guest, a white man in shorts and a rumpled t-shirt, was greeted with champagne and called by his name. The discrepancy was subtle, yet it screamed. It was almost 5 minutes of uncomfortable silence. Darius maintained his posture, his hands crossed in front of his body, while other guests were attended to, until she spoke again, not hiding the tone of doubt. "Can you please wait over there? You're a bit early. Access to the event isn't open yet." She pointed to an area near the revolving door, as if he were meant to stay out of the way. He nodded, walked to the indicated corner, and stood there, observing the movement around him. A child spilled juice on the carpet, and 3 employees ran to clean it up. An executive forgot his cell phone on the counter, and an attendant hurried to return it. But with Darius, time seemed to move slower. No one offered anything. No one asked any questions. It was as if he were a mistake in the setting, a character out of place. Minutes later, he tried once more. He returned to the counter, this time being attended by a young man with a crooked tie who seemed new on the job. "Good morning, I'm Darius Whitfield. I'm the CEO of Whitfield Dynamics and in charge of today's event." The young man frowned as if he had just heard a foreign name. "Are you sure? Because the room is already reserved by another company." Before Darius could reply, the same receptionist from before whispered something in his ear. The young man nodded, and with an almost mechanical gesture said, "You can wait outside, please. We're resolving an issue with the organization." Darius stood there for another second, as if deciding between 2 versions of himself, the one that demanded respect right there, and the one that knew certain battles are won without making a scene. He turned and left the lobby, but not the hotel. He stopped outside under the elegant awning covering the entrance, where the wind lightly brushed his face. He took his cell phone, opened the event group chat, and sent a short message to Jalen. "Meet me at the entrance." In less than 3 minutes, the assistant appeared, dressed in a light gray suit and carrying a clipboard with the day's schedule. When he saw Darius's face, no explanation was needed. "They didn't know who you were, right?" Jalen said. Darius gave a slight smile, devoid of humor. "They knew I was black and well-dressed. The rest, they chose to ignore." Jalen was silent for a few seconds, then suggested, "Do you want me to talk to someone?" Darius shook his head. "Not yet. But I want you to stay close." With Jalen by his side, Darius returned to the lobby for the third time. This time, the atmosphere seemed to freeze for a second. The receptionist adjusted herself in the chair. The young man with the crooked tie pretended to be focused on his computer. Darius walked straight to the counter and in a firm voice, yet without raising his tone, said, "I'll say it one more time clearly. I'm Darius Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Dynamics. I have an event booked for today. I need you to call the hotel coordinator now." This time, the receptionist did not respond with words. She just picked up the phone and dialed quickly. In less than 2 minutes, Gina appeared, a white woman in a beige blazer and immaculate shoes, carrying a tablet and a nervous smile. "Mr. Whitfield, I am deeply sorry for the misunderstanding. We were expecting, well, we didn't know you had already arrived." She tried to smooth over the situation with a rehearsed cordiality, but Darius knew how to recognize excuses that only arise when a name and title are spoken aloud. "It's all right, Gina. Let's just proceed with the day's agenda, shall we?" he replied, maintaining his courteous tone. Gina quickly agreed and led them to the area reserved for the speakers. On the way, Jalen exchanged a look with Darius, as if silently asking, "Are you going to let this slide?" Darius responded only with a subtle raise of an eyebrow. The lounge area was well equipped, with leather sofas, a counter with coffee and gourmet snacks. But there was something in the air, a subtle tension, as if the place was soaked in an unspoken discomfort. Darius grabbed a bottle of water, sat down calmly, and said to Jalen without taking his eyes off the schedule, "We're going to change everything." Jalen blinked slowly, trying to understand if he had heard correctly. Change everything? Like the layout? The order of the panels? Darius shook his head. "No, the hotel. We're moving the event to the Haze." Jalen's eyes widened. "Today? But boss, that's crazy. There are only 4 hours until the first panel." Darius calmly took a sip of his water. "Exactly, and 4 hours is enough time to do it right. Call Tammy. She'll know how to handle this without making a fuss." Jalen hesitated for a second, as if expecting Darius to backtrack, but that look, firm, centered, almost too serene, said it wasn't impulsive, it was a decision. No speeches, no anger. A silent change, yet with the weight of someone who knows exactly what he's doing. While Jalen left the room with his phone to his ear, Darius stood up and went to the frosted glass window. From up there, he could see part of San Jose still waking up. Cars slowly passing by, people with coffee in hand, and the sky beginning to brighten with timid shades of orange. He knew that the Grand Monarch was the hotel of major events, the darling of the tech elite. But he also knew that respect isn't measured by stars. One doesn't need to shout or demand. One only needs to do what they've always done, act with purpose. On the phone, he heard Jalen talking with Tammy, already in lightning operation mode. Meanwhile, he took a deep breath and thought of the phrase his father used to say, "When the place doesn't see you, you change the place, not your value." And at that moment, his value was non-negotiable. The process was initiated with surgical precision. Tammy, from the head office, sprang into action as if she had trained her entire life for that moment. She called the manager of the Haze, who immediately offered the necessary structure, not out of flattery, but because he already knew Darius and understood that opportunities like this don't come twice. Meanwhile, Jalen discreetly moved through the corridors of the Grand Monarch, informing the speakers, transferring guests, canceling coffee breaks, and coordinating the drivers. No one caused a fuss, no scene was made, but little by little, the main hall began to empty as if it had been struck by an invisible gust. The screens were turned off, the technicians started to pack up the equipment, and the buffet, still set up, was left untouched. Outside, Darius remained in the lounge, like a conductor commanding a symphony with a mere nod. When the hotel manager finally realized what was happening, he went to the room, visibly nervous. "Mr. Whitfield, is there a problem? We can adjust anything you need." Darius turned slowly, observed the man for a moment, and replied with a calm that froze the atmosphere. "You didn't offend me. You just disqualified yourselves." There was no raised voice, no accusation, but the silence that followed was louder than any argument. The manager tried to insist, murmuring something about a misunderstanding, but Darius had already turned away. The conversation was over before it even began. He simply grabbed his jacket and left. At the Haze, the atmosphere was entirely different from the very first moment. There was no red carpet or cascading glass installations from the ceiling, but there was something that the Grand Monarch failed to deliver: recognition. As soon as Darius entered the lobby, he was greeted with a genuine smile by the events manager, a woman named Melinda, who, upon shaking his hand, said, "We are honored to have you here, Mr. Whitfield. Whatever you need, we're ready." It wasn't flattery, it was preparation. It was that kind of welcome that needs no proof because it understands exactly who is in front of it. The staff were already briefed, the rooms were being prepared at a rapid pace, and the guests arrived gradually, many not even noticing that a change of scenery had occurred. And those who did notice, they whispered among themselves with respect, not curiosity. If Darius changed the venue, there must have been a reason. While the new auditorium was being set up and the support team organized the final details, Darius walked through the backstage area, discreetly checking if everyone was comfortable. In one of the corridors, he crossed paths with one of the international panelists who greeted him with admiration. "I heard you moved the entire event from the hotel in less than a morning. That's what I call leadership." Darius smiled, this time lightly. Sometimes, changing the environment is the only way to maintain the standard. There was no resentment in his voice, only clarity. When the event finally began, with the new logo projected on the screens of the Hazes auditorium and the seats filled with executives, engineers, students, and investors, the atmosphere pulsed with something greater than innovation. There was a collective sense of presence, of purpose. And when Darius took the stage for his opening speech, he didn't begin by talking about artificial intelligence or the future of automation. He began by talking about choice. Darius stood in the center of the stage, under a soft light that highlighted his presence more than his image. He didn't use a teleprompter or slides, just a lapel microphone, and that look that carried more than years of experience. It carried stories that were never told in investor pitches. "Today," he began with a firm and measured voice, "I wanted to open this event talking about technology, but before that, I need to talk about space. Not space as in outer space, nor digital space, the physical human space, the one we inhabit when we enter an environment." A slight murmur went through the audience, a collective adjustment of posture, as if preparing to hear something that went beyond expectations. "This morning reminded me that no matter how much we build companies, create jobs, and move markets, there are still doors that only open when someone sees the badge and not the person." The silence in the room was complete. No cell phone vibrated, no cup clinked. Darius continued, "The place where you choose to gather says a lot about what you consider important. And today, we are here, not because there was a booking error, nor a technical mishap. We are here because respect cannot be outsourced, and I refuse to teach the next generation that we have to shout to be heard." He then looked toward the back of the room, where a few young people from the social inclusion area were seated, attentive. "I learned that at 19, when I was ignored in a job selection because I didn't seem fit for the position. At the time, I left feeling diminished. Today, I walk away from those places not out of revolt, but because I know exactly who I am. And I don't have time anymore to convince anyone of that." The reaction was not of immediate applause, it was of held breath. of teary eyes, of people touched in places that cannot be reached with lines of code. When Darius concluded his speech with the phrase, "Not every mistake is an error, sometimes it is merely a reflection of where we still stand as a society," the audience erupted into applause. But these were not the protocol claps. They were the kind of hand beats that come from the chest, born from an intimate place where similar experiences have been stored for years. At the back of the auditorium, some members of the press covering the event were frantically typing on their laptops, already knowing they had a different story in hand. Others simply lowered their cameras for a few seconds, as if they needed to process what they had just witnessed. The following panel was delayed by 15 minutes, not due to a lack of organization, but because people simply did not want to leave. Every conversation in the corridor seemed to be an extension of what had been said on stage. The topics changed, but the gravitational center remained the same, the silent, decisive, and utterly transformative way in which Darius had handled the situation. Upstairs, while the workshops were taking place, the murmurs began to reach the Grand Monarch. Notifications popped up on Coordinator Gina's phone. Messages from suppliers wanting to know if the event had been cancelled or if the schedule had been postponed. One of the waiters quietly commented to another that the entire buffet would no longer be served. The hotel manager, still in shock, roamed from room to room, trying to find explanations for what was not a scandal, but a consequence. There were no last-minute headlines. There were no furious stories on social media. But the silence was deafening. The Redwoods Ballroom, designed to impress with its chandeliers and LED panels, now echoed with the solitary steps of employees dismantling what was to be the biggest event of the quarter. Some guests who had not yet received the new location were redirected via links on their phones. Others realized on their own by noticing that no one else was there. The Grand Monarch that day learned that when you fail at the basics, seeing people as people, no luxury can save your reputation. The event at the Haze ran like a well-tuned machine, not perfect, but alive. What would have been just another innovation conference turned into a live masterclass in leadership. Every panelist who took the stage, in some way, made reference to what had happened that morning. Some openly praised Darius, while others only highlighted the importance of environments that reflect values. But deep down, everyone knew something had changed. At the end of the afternoon, when the last panel concluded and the guests began leaving the hotel, many stopped by Darius just to shake his hand, not with that fanfare of a celebrity, but with the kind of respect that only comes from silent acknowledgement. It was as if each person was saying without words, "I saw and I learned." Hours later, in the back seat of the car, as the city lights began to turn on, Darius finally allowed himself a longer sigh. He loosened his shirt collar and rested his head against the leather seat back. Jalen, sitting beside him, looked out the window, still absorbing everything. After a few minutes of silence, he turned and asked, "Have you never thought about just lowering your guard with them? Telling some hard truths, showing that they were really wrong?" Darius slowly turned his face, with that half smile that carried more story than answers. "I've thought about it, yes. A long time ago, in a restaurant, in an interview, even in a watch store. But you know what I learned? Every time we have to explain ourselves to be respected, we lose a little bit of what is already rightfully ours. Today, I just wanted to show how it's possible to walk away whole from a place that tried to diminish you." Jalen nodded slowly, as if listening to something that isn't taught in an MBA. The next morning, the Whitfield Dynamics office was quieter than usual. Not because there was less work, but because everyone seemed to carry something different in their eyes, as if they were still digesting what they had seen, heard, and felt. Darius arrived early, as always. He greeted each person with a nod or a slight smile, without changing his routine, as if the previous day had been just another ordinary Tuesday. But for Elijah, one of the newest analysts on the team, that day had been anything but ordinary. He had been watching Darius from a distance since he joined the company, fascinated by his firm presence and the almost supernatural ability to handle difficult situations without losing his composure. Elijah waited until the end of the day to approach him. "Boss, may I ask you something?" Darius, already tucking the last papers into his briefcase, nodded with a gesture. "How do you keep it all inside? Because if it were me, I swear, I would have exploded right then and there." Darius closed his briefcase slowly, leaned against the edge of the desk, and replied with the same patience he'd use with someone learning to walk. "It's not about holding it in. It's about choosing what's worth letting out. Yesterday, I could have shouted, made headlines, demanded a public apology, but what would that have taught you? Or the others who were watching?" Elijah fell silent, absorbing those words as if hearing a truth that doesn't immediately fit. "I just kept thinking about how many times we swallow frogs, and it seems like no one notices," he murmured. Darius smiled without bitterness. "But they notice. They always notice. The difference is what you do with it. If you respond by shouting, you become just another noise. If you act with purpose, you become an example." Elijah nodded, moved. It was as if, right there in that office with its grey carpet and glass walls, a kind of transfer had taken place, not of rank but of vision, and that was the true legacy. In the days that followed, corporate networks began discussing the incident, not with scandal, but with admiration. No one knew exactly who had spread the word, but a single photo was enough. The empty entrance of the Grand Monarch on the day of the event contrasted with a vibrant image of the haze-packed auditorium to give the story strength. Leadership blogs started publishing articles about the CEO who didn't need to shout to be heard. Consultants debated Darius's stance in strategy newsletters. A business portal published an article titled "When Silence Speaks Louder" and transforms reputations. The Grand Monarch, for its part, tried to react. It offered free stays to some companies, tried to bury the matter with last-minute promotions, but no one was impressed. The damage didn't come from a public scandal, but from a clear message. Respect is not demanded. It is chosen. And Darius had chosen to walk away. However, Darius did not comment to the press. He didn't post on social media. He didn't write an open letter. His silence remained his most powerful statement. In an informal afternoon coffee with his leadership team, someone remarked, "The competition is trying to replicate the model of our event." But it seems they didn't understand what made it work. Darius merely smiled and replied, "They can copy the stage, the script, even the coffee break, but they can't replicate purpose." That same week, HR received an unusually high number of resumes from young professionals, many of them saying they wanted to work in a place where leadership has face, courage, and conscience. For most, it seemed like a natural consequence of strong positioning. But for Darius, it was confirmation that he didn't have to wait another 20 years to see the fruits of his choice. They were already emerging the very next day in the eyes of every Elijah who felt a little more seen. On the Friday of that same week, as Darius crossed the main corridor of Whitfield Dynamics on his way to the meeting room, he paused for a second in front of a small scene that, for anyone else, might have gone unnoticed. Two interns were sitting at a side table, speaking in low voices about how they would react if they experienced something similar to what the boss had gone through at the hotel. One of them said, "I think I would lose my mind." The other replied, "But that's exactly why he did what he did, to show that you don't have to lose your mind to maintain respect." Darius did not interrupt. He simply observed, as if watching a seed germinate in the middle of the sidewalk. Sometimes, the greatest victories do not occur in grand halls, but in small conversations among people who are still learning how to assert themselves in the world. He continued walking, certain that this, indeed, was a legacy being built in real time. Later, while tidying up some notes in his office, Jalen appeared at the door with a restrained smile. "There's something you need to see." He handed over a tablet with a freshly published report. The headline was direct: They always saw him. They just didn't expect him to be the one signing the checks. Darius read in silence. The article was accurate, respectful, without sensationalism. It spoke of the event, the change of venue, the stance taken. But more than that, it spoke of the choice to not retaliate with anger, but with discernment. When he finished reading, he handed the tablet back to Jalen and simply said, "They saw." Jalen agreed, and everyone else did too. But Darius, as always, did not need that kind of validation. His goal was never applause, it was impact. At the end of the day, with the office already empty and the San Jose sun bidding farewell through the wide windows, Darius stayed a few minutes alone in his room. He looked at the wall where he hung an old photo. Him at 19 in a simple white shirt, leaving the interview where he was never called back. He remembered how invisible he had felt that afternoon. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of silent pain, as if realizing that one must fight not only to get into places, but to be recognized within them. At that time, he promised himself that one day he would do things differently. And now, looking out at the city, he knew for sure he had. Without clamor, without confusion, simply by walking away from what did not deserve him and carrying with him all those who still didn't know that they too could do the same. Before leaving, he turned off the lights and crossed the now empty corridor. He paused for a moment at the entrance, looked around and smiled, not for success or prestige, but because he knew that his presence in that space was no longer a solitary conquest. It was a permanent invitation for others to claim their own. And when Jalen joined him in the elevator, Darius looked ahead and said, almost as a reminder more to himself than to the world, "They always saw me. They just never imagined that I'd be the one in charge."